All right, so get this. You send us this document called The Report from Iron Mountain on the Possibility and Desirability of Peace. And let me tell you, it's a wild ride. Yeah. Picture this, 1960s Cold War paranoia at its peak. And this group of intellectuals, they're holed up in a corporate nuclear bunker.
Yeah.
Not just any bunker, though. We're talking a luxury doomsday hideout built by the likes of Standard Oil,
Yeah.
manufacturers Hanover Trust, Shell.
Yeah.
You know the whole gangs here. And what's their mission, you ask? To figure out what a world without war would actually look like.
Now, most people would assume, their conclusion would be something like, peace is great, let's all get along.
Yeah.
But this report flips that on its head. It argues that lasting peace, while achievable, might actually be bad for society.
Oh.
It's a pretty bold claim, wouldn't you say?
It is. It makes you wonder if they were just in that bunker a little too long. But the more you dig into it, the more you realize they weren't just trying to be provocative or anything. They were trying to understand war as a system with its own rules and functions, woven into the very fabric of our world.
They called it the war system. And their argument is that it's not just about armies and battles, it's about how war shapes our economy, our politics, our social structures, even our culture.
Okay, so let's unpack this whole war system thing. Where do they even begin to break down something so massive?
Well, they start with economics, and this is where it gets really interesting. Their argument is that war, despite being incredibly destructive, actually plays a crucial role in maintaining economic stability.
Wait, so they're saying war is good for the economy? That doesn't sound right.
Not good, exactly, but necessary. Think of it this way. War is the ultimate government spending program. It creates demand, boosts production, keeps people employed. And according to the report, this constant churn is essential for preventing economic stagnation.
So it's like a pressure valve. If the economy gets too hot, war acts as a release, even if that release is incredibly destructive.
Exactly. The report actually points to World War II as an example. They claim that despite the devastation, civilian living standards in many countries actually rose during the war because of all the wartime production. Of course, this overlooks the immense human cost, but it highlights their point. War, as horrible as it is, can be a powerful economic engine.
That's pretty chilling. It's like they're saying we need a certain level of chaos to keep things running smoothly. But it's not just economics, right? They also talk about the political functions of war.
Right, and this is where things get even more unsettling. The report argues that the very possibility of war is what gives governments their power. We need an enemy, a threat to rally against, to justify authority and maintain order.
It's like that age-old saying, if you want peace, prepare for war. But this report takes it a step further, suggesting that sometimes those threats are manufactured. They're manufactured to meet the needs of the war system. It's almost as if conflict itself becomes the goal.
And think about how that idea applies to internal security as well. The report draws a direct line between the military and the police, essentially arguing that the police are a form of internal military, enforcing order within a society, just as the military defends against external threats.
It's a pretty cynical view of human nature, isn't it? That we need this constant fear, this looming threat of violence to keep us in line.
Well, that's the crux of the report's argument. They're not saying it's right or wrong. They're simply trying to analyze the systems at play, to understand the often hidden functions of war. And those functions, they argue, they go even deeper than just economics and politics. They extend to the very fabric of our society, shaping our social structures and behaviors in profound ways.
So war isn't just about fighting. It's also about social control. It's like we've created a system that relies on conflict to function, both internally and externally. And now I'm even more curious to see where they go with this.
Well, that's what we'll dive into next. Get ready for some even more thought-provoking and possibly disturbing ideas.
All right, so we've established that war, according to this report, it's like this massive complex machine with all these hidden gears and levers. But then the report asks this crazy question. What happens if we try to turn the machine off? What happens if we actually achieve world peace?
And that's where things get really interesting, because their conclusion, it isn't a celebration of peace, it's more like a warning. They argue that simply ending war, that wouldn't be enough. We'd have to replace its functions, all of its roles in society, with something equally effective.
It's like trying to swap out the engine of a car while it's still running. You can't just yank out one part without having a replacement ready to go. Yeah. But how do you even begin to replace something as ingrained as war?
Well, the report actually proposes a few, let's call them creative solutions. For example, to address the economic function of war, they suggest massive public works projects, but with a twist. They have to be deliberately wasteful.
Wasteful. Why would we want to waste resources?
The report's logic is that these projects would need to be, how do we put this? They need to be non-productive in the traditional sense. It's not about building useful infrastructure. It's about creating a sink for excess resources and capital, a way to keep the economic engine from overheating.
So instead of building tanks and bombs, we'd be building giant pyramids in the desert, or maybe underwater cities. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but I can kind of see their point. We'd still need something to spend money on, something to keep people employed, even if it doesn't have any practical value.
Exactly. And they even suggest things like giant space programs with unattainable goals.
Yeah.
Imagine a society where instead of fighting wars, we're all collectively focused on building a colony on Mars, even if it's technologically impossible. It's almost like they're suggesting we need these grand, even absurd projects to replace the grand, absurd project of war.
Okay. Starting to see how their minds work. But what about the political side of things? How do you replace that sense of external threat, that us versus them mentality that the report says is so crucial for maintaining order?
Well, they have a few ideas. And they range from the somewhat plausible to the downright terrifying. One suggestion is a global police force with immense power, kind of like a super UN that can enforce its will on any nation.
But wouldn't that just be trading one form of authority for another? Wouldn't we still need some kind of enemy to justify that level of global power? It feels like we're just shifting the problem, not really solving it.
You're right, and the report acknowledges this. They admit that true peace would likely mean the end of national sovereignty as we know it. So this global police force would essentially be the new government, the new external authority figure that societies seem to crave.
It's almost like they're saying we need a big brother, whether it's a nation state or a global entity, but then they get even wilder with their suggestions. They actually propose a manufactured alien threat.
Yes. Believe it or not, they suggest that fabricating an extraterrestrial enemy, that could be a way to unify humanity and create that sense of shared purpose, an external danger that the war system provides. It's like a real-life War of the Worlds, but orchestrated by our own governments.
Okay, now that's just straight out of a science fiction novel. I mean, it's not like governments haven't used propaganda and fear-mongering before, but a fake alien invasion, that's a whole new level.
But remember, the report isn't necessarily endorsing these ideas. They're presenting them more as thought experiments, as potential solutions to the very real problem of replacing war's functions. And as outlandish as they may seem, they highlight just how deeply ingrained the need for conflict seems to be in our societies.
It's like they're saying we're so used to having an enemy that if we don't have a real one, we'll just make one up. It's kind of depressing, actually. But we've covered the economic and political functions of war. What about the social side of things? How do you replace the role that war plays in shaping our social structures and behaviors?
Well, that's where the report dives into some even more ethically ambiguous territory. Remember the concept of antisocial elements that we talked about earlier? The idea that war serves as an outlet for those who don't fit into conventional society.
Yeah, like how the military can act as a pressure valve for social unrest, especially during times of high unemployment. It's a pretty disturbing concept, honestly.
Well, the report takes that concept and runs with it. They argue that in a world without war, we'd need to find new ways to channel those antisocial tendencies. And their suggestions are, well, let's just say they're not for the faint of heart. One idea is a militarized Peace Corps, essentially a global force of young people dedicated to social good, but with a very strict, almost military-like structure.
So basically turning potential troublemakers into productive citizens. It's kind of like a giant boot camp for social good. I see how that might work, but it feels a little coercive, doesn't it?
Right, and that's the dilemma the report keeps coming back to. Can you have true peace without some level of social control? Can you have individual freedom without sacrificing some degree of collective order?
It's like they're saying we need to find a balance
between
freedom and control. And they're not sure if it's even possible. But they don't stop there, do they? They also have some pretty wild ideas for how to replace the social cohesion that war supposedly provides.
Remember how they talked about manufacturing an alien threat to create a sense of unity? Well, they also suggest a more, how should I put this, a more earthly solution. Deliberately accelerating environmental pollution.
Wait, what? Making things worse on purpose? That seems counterintuitive, to say the least.
Their logic is that a shared environmental crisis, a looming ecological disaster, could be the new enemy that unites humanity. It's a pretty bleak solution, I'll admit, but that highlights their point. We seem to need some kind of existential threat to motivate us, to bind us together.
So instead of fighting each other, we'd be fighting against climate change. I guess it's a less violent form of conflict, but it still doesn't sound very peaceful.
And that's the paradox the report lays bare. It's like they're saying true peace, a world without conflict, might actually require us to change fundamentally as a species, to rethink our basic assumptions about how societies function.
All very thought-provoking, but I'm starting to wonder if they're just being intentionally provocative. Like, are they actually suggesting these solutions, or are they just trying to point out how difficult it would be to create a truly peaceful world?
That's a great question, and one that we'll explore further as we delve into the report's final conclusions and the potential implications of their findings.
Okay, my brain is officially fried after all that. Wasteful space programs, global police, fake alien invasions, even like deliberately polluting the planet. I'm starting to think a little war might actually sound peaceful compared to all that.
Well, yeah, that's kind of the point the report's getting at, isn't it? They're not saying these are good solutions, obviously. More like they're trying to highlight how hard it would be, you know, to replace the functions of war without creating new problems, potentially even bigger problems.
But if all the replacements are so out there, so ethically messed up, doesn't that mean the whole premise is flawed? Like maybe peace isn't impossible. Maybe we just haven't figured out the right way to get there yet.
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility. And it's something the report doesn't really consider. They seem to think that human nature is just fundamentally broken, that we're always going to be driven by conflict and competition. But maybe there's another side to the coin. Maybe we're just as capable of cooperation and empathy, if not more so.
It's like that whole nature versus nurture thing, right?
Yeah.
Are we programmed for war? Or is it something we learn? And if it is learned, can we unlearn it?
Now, those are the million-dollar questions. And we got to remember, this report was written during the Cold War, when nuclear annihilation was a very real possibility. It's possible their thinking was shaped by all that, by that feeling of constant tension, that potential for global conflict.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Maybe today, with a bit more distance from that time, we can be a bit more optimistic. But even if we don't agree with all their solutions, this report still brings up some important points.
Oh, absolutely. It makes us confront this uncomfortable truth, that peace isn't just the absence of war. It's a much bigger challenge.
It's more than just putting down our weapons. It's about creating a world where we don't even need them in the first place. It's a lot harder, but way more worthwhile.
Yeah, and one of the most important takeaways for me is that we can't just accidentally stumble into peace. It has to be intentional, it has to be planned out, and it has to deal with those deep-rooted needs in society. Needs that war has always kind of addressed, however imperfectly.
So what does this all mean for us? We're not politicians or world leaders or anything, just regular people trying to make sense of the world.
I think the biggest value of this report is that it forces us to think critically, to question what we think we know about war and peace, to go deeper and wrestle with these big questions about human nature and the systems we build.
It's like they're holding up a mirror to society and saying, look, this is what you've created. What are you going to do about it?
Exactly. And it reminds us that seeking peace isn't passive, it's active. It takes constant work, critical thinking, and a willingness to challenge the way things are.
And it may be, just maybe, it takes a little bit of hope, too. A belief that we're not stuck in these cycles of violence forever.
You know, on that note, I want to leave you with one final thought. The report spends a lot of time on the potential downsides of peace, the challenges, the dangers. But what about the good stuff? What could we achieve if we weren't constantly pouring resources and energy into fighting? What kind of world could we build if we truly dedicated ourselves to cooperation, to understanding, to compassion?
That's a powerful image, and one that gives us a lot to think about. So there you have it, the report from Iron Mountain. It's a tough read, full of unsettling ideas, but ultimately it leaves us with more questions than answers. And maybe that's the whole point. Maybe the real journey is in wrestling with these complex issues and finding our own answers. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.